For 16 years, they called her the foolish girl. The girl who paid $75 for a piece of junk. The girl whose father had just died. The girl whose mother told her to sell the farm. The girl who walked into a barn full of 200 men on an April morning in 1969 and bought a tractor that had not run since the Truman administration. They laughed at her. For 16 years. They were wrong. About all of it, but it would take her 16 years of being laughed at. 16 years of cold workshops and broken knuckles and a mother who would not speak to her. 16 years of holding on when every man in Dawson County, Nebraska, told her to let go, before she would find what was hidden inside that tractor. Something a dying man had welded into the engine in November of 1952. Something that had been waiting for the right person to find it. This is the story of Margaret Holloway. This is the story of the $75 tractor. And this is the story of what was hiding inside it. The barn smelled like old motor oil and dust. 40 years of it. Margaret Holloway stood in the middle of that smell in the spring of 1986, holding a letter that had turned the color of weak tea. Her hands were shaking. They had not shaken like this in a long time. Not since the funeral. Not since the auction. Not since the night she slept on the workshop floor with her father's notebook pressed against her chest like a prayer. She was 39 years old. She had 80 acres of corn and soybeans outside her window, a red tractor in the yard, a mother in the kitchen baking bread, a reputation in 3 counties as the best mechanic anybody knew. And in her hands, she held the answer to a question she had been asking for 16 years. Why was this engine sealed? Why did somebody care enough to wrap it like a body in a coffin and then walk away? She looked down at the letter. The handwriting was neat. Careful. The kind of handwriting a man uses when he knows it might be the last thing he ever writes. Margaret pressed the paper against her chest, and she thought, about a girl, about $75, about a barn full of laughter. It was April of 1968. The fields outside Lexington, Nebraska, were just starting to wake up. Soft green showing in the brown. The smell of thawed dirt. That particular sound a tractor makes when it's the only thing moving for miles. A low, steady chug, like a heartbeat across the prairie. Thomas Holloway was 51 years old. He was a quiet man, the kind who said what he meant and meant what he said and didn't say much in between. He had farmed those 80 acres for 19 years. He had built the barn with his own hands. He had raised one daughter and loved her like she was the only daughter in the world, which, as far as he was concerned, she was. That morning, Thomas climbed onto his 1954 Farmall Super M and drove out to plow the north field. He never came back. The neighbor's boy found him, a heart attack. Quick, the doctor said. He probably didn't feel much. Margaret hated that sentence. He probably didn't feel much. What kind of comfort was that? What kind of words? Like a man's last moment alive was nothing more than a sigh on the wind. She felt plenty. She felt enough for both of them. The funeral was on a Tuesday. It rained the way Nebraska rains in spring, sideways and angry, and the wind blew the umbrellas inside out, and the men gripped their hats, and the women gripped each other, and Margaret stood at the edge of the grave and did not cry. She would cry later, but not there, not with all those people watching. Her mother, Eleanor, stood beside her. 47 years old, black coat, black gloves. Hair pulled back so tight it looked like it hurt. Eleanor had been a farmer's wife for 26 years, and she knew what came next. The bills, The lawyers, the neighbors with casseroles. The slow, polite drowning that comes when a family loses the man who was supposed to keep the boat afloat. Eleanor did not cry either. The Holloway women did not cry in public. That was the rule. After the funeral, they drove home in silence. The pickup smelled like wet wool and her father's cologne, the cheap kind from the drugstore that he wore every Sunday. Margaret pressed her face against the window and watched the fields blur past. She thought. She thought about everything she did not know how to do. The rent on the equipment, the note at the bank. The way the corn had to be in the ground by mid-May or the whole season was wasted. She thought about her mother and how thin Eleanor had gotten in the last 6 months and how her hands trembled when she poured coffee. She thought, and the thinking did not stop. Not that night, not the next, not for a long, long time. 2 weeks after the funeral, Margaret found the notebook. It was in the bottom drawer of her father's workshop desk. A small leather notebook, the kind a man buys at the feed store for 75 cents and keeps in his pocket. She almost missed it. She was looking for receipts. She was looking for anything that might tell her how deep the hole was. The notebook was at the back, behind a tin of nails. She opened it. Most of it was numbers. Bushels per acre, rainfall, the price of seed, the price of diesel, the slow, careful bookkeeping of a man who never trusted his own memory. But the last page was different. It was dated 9 days before he died, written in pencil. The kind of pencil you sharpen with a pocket knife. It said, "Maggie, if you're reading this, something happened. Don't be scared. Listen to me. The world is going to tell you who you are. Don't listen. Decide for yourself. That's the only thing that matters. The only thing. Love, Dad." Margaret sat down on the cold workshop floor. She read it again, and then she cried. The way she had not cried at the funeral. The way she had not cried since she was 7 years old, and her father had carried her in from the rain. She cried until her chest hurt, and her eyes burned, and the notebook was wet enough that she was afraid the pencil might smudge. So she stopped. She wiped her face. She put the notebook in her pocket, and she went outside into the dark to look at the broken tractor in the yard. For a year, she did the impossible. She borrowed equipment. She rented machinery. She begged favors from neighbors who looked at her with pity and a little embarrassment, the way men look at a young woman doing a job they think she shouldn't be doing. Eleanor wanted her to sell. That was the first big fight. It happened in the kitchen. Late June. The cicadas were screaming outside, and the air was so thick you could chew it. Eleanor said, "Margaret, sit down. I need to talk to you." Margaret sat. Eleanor poured 2 cups of coffee. Her hands did not tremble that day. That should have been a warning. "I've been talking to your Aunt Doris," Eleanor said, "in Grand Island." "Mom, just listen." "Mom, I know what you're going to say." "Margaret, I'm not selling. You haven't even heard me. I don't have to." Eleanor's mouth went thin. That thin, straight line Margaret had been afraid of since she was small. "Margaret, the land is not for a girl alone. Your father knew that. He would have wanted you safe. He would have wanted me here. You don't know what he wanted." "I do." "You don't." "I do, Mom." Margaret pulled the notebook out of her pocket. She slid it across the table. She did not say anything. She just watched her mother's face as Eleanor read the last page. Eleanor read it once. She read it twice. She closed the notebook. She put her hand over her mouth. And then, very slowly, she said, "He never told me he wrote that. I found it after. Margaret, I'm not selling, Mom. I'm not. Eleanor looked out the kitchen window. The sun was going down red over the fields, her husband's fields, her daughter's fields, the fields that had held the family up for almost 2 decades and were now somehow supposed to keep holding them up without him. Eleanor said, "Then God help you, Margaret, because nobody else will." That was the night Margaret started saving for the auction. She had $80. That was everything. Every coin in the jar, every dollar from the egg money, every nickel she had saved from selling jam at the church bazaar. $80 in small bills, folded twice, kept in an envelope inside a coffee can on the top shelf of her father's workshop. The auction was in April of 1969. She had just turned 22 the week before. Eleanor had baked a cake. They had eaten it in silence. Neither one of them said happy birthday out loud, because saying it out loud would have meant admitting that Thomas was not there to say it. The Dawson County Equipment Auction was held on a Saturday. The morning was clear and cold, the kind of cold that bites your fingers when you forget your gloves. Margaret drove the pickup the 11 miles into town. She parked at the edge of the lot. She got out. She took a breath. And she walked into a sea of men. 200 of them, maybe more. Farmers in overalls. Dealers in clean shirts. Old men chewing tobacco. Young men with their hands in their pockets. The smell of diesel and coffee and cigarette smoke. The sound of an auctioneer warming up his voice somewhere in the distance. Margaret was the only woman. She felt it the way you feel a draft in a cold house. Not all at once. Just a slow awareness. Heads turning. Eyes following her. Some curious, some amused, some polite enough to look away. She kept walking. She found the equipment lined up in rows. Tractors, plows, combines, the ordinary tools of an ordinary life, all waiting to be sold to the highest bidder. And at the far end of the lot, separated from everything else, sat a tractor. It was a 1948 Farmall M. It had not run in 17 years. The red paint had faded to the color of dried blood. The tires were flat and cracked. There was a bird's nest in the air cleaner. Somebody had scratched the word junk into the hood with a nail, and no one had bothered to scratch it out. Margaret stood there and looked at it. She thought, that tractor looks like how I feel. She thought, that tractor is mine. She did not know why. She just knew. The auctioneer was a man named Buck Reasoner. He was 64 years old and had been calling auctions in Dawson County since the Truman administration. He had a voice like a saw blade and a face like an old boot. He called the good equipment first. The John Deere 4020, the IH 706, the Massey Ferguson. They sold fast, hands going up all over the crowd, prices climbing into the thousands. Buck Reasoner sang the numbers like a hymn. And then, last of all, he came to the Farmall. He looked at it. He looked at the crowd. He sighed. All right, folks. Last item of the day. 1948 Farmall M from the Whitaker estate. Sat in a barn since '52. Probably good for parts. Probably. A few chuckles. Do I hear $50? $50 for a piece of genuine American history? Silence. Buck tried again. 25. Somebody give me 25. Silence. He was about to move on. Margaret could see it on his face. He was about to call it done. And in 2 seconds, the Farmall was going to be hauled off to a salvage yard and crushed into scrap metal, and that would be the end of it. She raised her hand. 50. Buck Reasoner squinted at her like he was not sure she was real. I'm sorry, miss. $50. The crowd went quiet. A different kind of quiet. The kind of quiet that means everybody is paying attention now and nobody knows quite what to do about it. Buck recovered. I have 50. Do I hear 60? Nothing. 60? Anybody? Going once at 50? Going twice? 75, Margaret said. She heard it before she understood she had said it. Buck blinked. Miss, you are bidding against yourself. I know. You sure about that, honey? Yes. The laughter started somewhere in the back. It rolled forward like a wave. Big country laughter, the kind that has nowhere to hide. Men slapped each other on the shoulder. Men wiped their eyes. The bird in the air cleaner of the Farmall flew out and disappeared into the gray morning sky. Buck Reasoner brought down his gavel. Sold to the young lady for $75. God help us all. More laughter. Margaret walked to the payment table. She did not look at anyone. She counted out $75 in small bills. The clerk took the money. He gave her a receipt. He gave her a look that said, I'm sorry, honey, but you brought this on yourself. She folded the receipt. She put it in her pocket, and then, as she turned to walk back across the lot, she saw him. An old man, white hair, maybe 70. Standing at the edge of the crowd, by himself, wearing a brown coat that had seen better years. He was looking at her. He was not laughing. He was not smiling. He was just looking. And as their eyes met, the old man nodded. A small nod. A nod like he knew something. Then he turned and walked away. Margaret would not understand that nod for 14 years. She was almost to her truck when Harold Brennan stepped in front of her. He was 47 years old. He was the John Deere dealer in Lexington and the biggest equipment man in 3 counties. He wore a clean white shirt with the sleeves rolled up just so, and a wristwatch that caught the light, and the kind of confident smile a man wears when he has never once in his life been told he is wrong. He blocked her path. Margaret Holloway. Mr. Brennan, you don't know me, but I knew your father. I know who you are. He smiled wider, the smile a man gives a child who has done something almost charming. Margaret, honey, I'm going to do you a favor. I don't need a favor. Yes, you do. No, sir, I don't. He laughed, a short laugh, not unkind. Worse than unkind. Patient. Look, I'll buy that tractor off you for $40, cash, right now. You walk out of here with most of your money still in your pocket. We pretend this never happened. Your father, God rest him, doesn't roll over in his grave. What do you say? Margaret looked at him. She looked at his white shirt, his clean fingernails, his confident smile. The way he stood with his weight on one hip, like a man who had never had to lift anything heavy in his life. She thought about her father. She thought about the notebook. She said, Mr. Brennan, my father taught me one thing above all the others. He taught me that the worst thing a person can do is let somebody else decide who they are. You don't get to decide that for me. Nobody does. The smile slipped just a little. Margaret, excuse me. She stepped around him. She walked to her truck. Behind her, she heard him say something to the men nearby, and she heard the laughter start up again, that big country laughter that had followed her across the whole lot. It chased her into the cab of the pickup. It chased her down the highway. It chased her all the way home. She did not let it catch her. She drove with both hands on the wheel. She did not cry. Not yet. The tractor weighed more than 4,000 pounds, and it would not move. The tires were flat. The wheels were locked. The steering was frozen solid. Margaret stood in the auction yard staring at it with the late afternoon sun in her eyes, and she realized that buying the thing had been only the first impossible problem. The second was getting it home. She had no trailer. She had no winch. She had no neighbor to call, because most of the neighbors were the same men who had just laughed at her. Except one. She did not know his name yet. He walked up to her while she was standing there with her hands on her hips, trying to think. He was the old man from the crowd, the one in the brown coat. White hair, maybe 70? He had a slow walk, like a man with bad knees, and he stopped about 6 feet away and took his hat off. Miss Holloway. Yes, sir? My name is Wendell Halloran. I live 2 miles east of you on the section road. I know your farm. I have a flatbed trailer and a winch. Margaret blinked. Mr. Halloran? Wendell. Wendell, why? He looked at the Farmall. He looked at the ground. He said very quietly, Your father saved my life one time, long time ago. I never paid him back. I'd like to start. She did not know what to say. She said, Thank you. He nodded. He put his hat back on, and he went to get his truck. It took 3 hours to drag the Farmall onto Wendell's trailer. 3 hours of pulling and prying and chalking the wheels with scraps of wood. 3 hours of Margaret skinning her knuckles on rusted bolts, and Wendell wheezing in the cold, and the sun sinking lower, and the auction yard emptying out around them, until it was just the two of them, and the dying light, and the dead tractor. They did not talk much. Wendell was not a talking man, but once, while they were resting on the trailer hitch, he looked at her sideways and said, Why this one? This one what? This tractor. I don't know. You don't know? No, sir. I just looked at it, and I knew. Wendell was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Some things are like that. He did not explain. She did not ask. But later, when she would think back on that day, she would remember the way he said it. Some things are like that. Like he had seen something like it before. Like he had stood in a barn one time, a long time ago, and known something he could not explain. He drove the trailer to her farm. They pushed the Farmall down a set of plank ramps into the workshop. It took everything they had. When the wheels finally rolled the last few inches onto the dirt floor of the shop, Margaret sat down on an overturned bucket and could not get up for a full minute. Wendell climbed back into his truck. He said, You need anything, you come find me. Wendell. Yes, ma'am? Why didn't you bid on it? He looked at her. His face did not change. He said, It wasn't mine to bid on. And then he drove away. Eleanor was waiting in the kitchen. The light over the table was on. The curtains were drawn. There was a plate of cold supper on the counter, and a cup of coffee gone gray with cooling. Eleanor sat at the table with her hands folded. Margaret came in through the back door. She tried to slip past her mother. She did not make it. Margaret. Mom, I'm tired. Sit down. Mom. Margaret, sit down. She sat. Eleanor looked at her daughter the way Eleanor looked at things she did not understand. Carefully, slowly, like she was trying to read a book in a language she had never learned. You spent $75. Yes. On a tractor that does not run. Yes. In front of every man in the county. Yes. Eleanor stood up. She did not raise her voice. She never raised her voice. That was the worst thing about her mother. She did not have to. Your father is dead, Margaret. I know. You are not a man. I know. This is not your work. Mom, Listen to me. Listen. This is not your work. Do you hear me? Margaret stood up. She was shaking. She could feel it in her knees, in her hands, in her jaw. But she stood up, and she looked her mother in the eye, and she said, in a voice she did not know she had, "Then whose is it, Mom? Whose work is it? Because Dad is gone. And if it isn't mine, it isn't anybody's. And the land will go to the bank. And the bank will sell it to Harold Brennan. And there will be nothing left of him. Of us. Of any of it." Eleanor's mouth moved. Nothing came out. Margaret picked up her coat. She walked out the back door. She went to the workshop, and she slept there that night, on a pile of old grain sacks, with her father's notebook in her hand, and the dead tractor watching her from the dark. She woke before dawn. The workshop was cold, the kind of cold that gets into your bones and stays. She sat up. She rubbed her face. She looked at the Farmall, and the Farmall looked back at her with its blank dead headlights, and she thought, all right, where do I start? She thought about her father, about the times she had stood beside him in this same workshop, watching him take an engine apart. He had taught her to weld when she was 12. He had taught her to grind valves at 14. He had let her rebuild the carburetor on the Super M the summer she was 16. And when she had gotten it wrong, he had not yelled. He had just shown her again. Every broken machine is a puzzle, Maggie. You just have to find the first piece. The first piece. She walked around the tractor. Slowly, the way her father would have done it. Hand on the hood. Hand on the fender. Crouching to look at the underside. Standing back to look at the hole. She started with the oil. She did not know why she started there. She just did. She crawled under the Farmall on her back. The dirt floor was cold against her shoulder blades. She found the drain plug on the oil pan and got a wrench on it and put her weight against the wrench, and the plug groaned and finally gave. The oil came out slow. She watched it, and something was wrong. She did not see it at first. She just felt it, the way a person feels something is off before they know what it is. She let the oil drain into a coffee can. She watched it pool. She dipped a finger in it and held it up to the workshop light. It was dark. It was thick. But it was not the color of 17-year-old oil. She had drained 17-year-old oil before. She had drained it out of her father's old Alice Chalmers, the one that had sat under a tarp behind the corn crib for almost 2 decades. That oil had been black as tar, thick as molasses, half solid in the can. This oil was dirty, but it was not that dirty. Margaret sat up. She wiped her hands on her jeans. She crawled back under the tractor and ran her hand along the oil pan and felt for the bolts that held the pan to the engine block. And there, right at the seam, she felt something she should not have felt. A line of something, hard, smooth, not metal, not rust, sealant. Somebody had sealed the oil pan to the block, not bolted, sealed, with some kind of waterproof compound she had never seen on a farm tractor in her life. She crawled back out. She stood up. She walked around the Farmall, slow, in the gray morning light filtering through the workshop window. She looked at the engine. She looked at the man-made line of sealant running along the seam of the crankcase, the kind of line a man puts on a coffin before he buries it. She looked at the freshish oil in the can at her feet, and she said, out loud, to nobody, "Why?" The Farmall did not answer. It would not answer for 16 more years. That afternoon, Eleanor came out to the workshop. She did not knock. There was no door to knock on. She just stepped into the open frame and stood there with her arms crossed against the cold. Margaret had grease up to her elbows. She had the air cleaner off. The bird's nest was sitting on a piece of newspaper on the workbench. 3 small blue eggs, fossilized and dry, like little stones from another century. Eleanor said, "Margaret." "Yes, Mom." "I brought you a sandwich." Margaret looked up. Her mother was holding a plate. On the plate was a sandwich, white bread, ham, the corner of a pickle. Eleanor set the plate on a clean spot on the workbench. She did not look at the tractor. She did not say anything about the tractor. She just said, "Eat. You haven't eaten since yesterday." Margaret said, "Mom, eat." Eleanor turned to leave, and then, halfway out the door, without turning around, Eleanor said one more thing. She said it quietly, almost like she did not want Margaret to hear. She said, "Your father always said you could fix anything." Then she was gone. Margaret stood there in the workshop, holding a wrench in one hand, looking at a sandwich on a plate, while a dead tractor sat behind her, and a dead father whispered through her mother's voice, and the $75 she had spent yesterday felt suddenly like the most important $75 in the world. She did not cry, but it was close. She sat down on the bucket. She ate the sandwich, and then, with the taste of ham and pickle still in her mouth, she stood back up, picked up the wrench, and started on the engine again. By the end of that first week, the whole county knew. The Holloway girl had bought the Whitaker tractor. The Holloway girl had paid $75 for a piece of junk. The Holloway girl was out in her father's workshop, alone, taking apart an engine that would never run. At the feed store, they laughed. At the diner, they laughed. At the gas station, the men set down their coffee cups and shook their heads and said, "That poor girl. That poor girl." Thomas Holloway must be spinning in his grave. Harold Brennan drove past her place once that week. He drove slow. He looked at the open workshop door, at the legs sticking out from under the tractor, at the small smudge of a young woman covered in grease. He smiled. He kept driving. He told his wife at dinner that night, "That girl is going to lose everything. Watch. By Christmas, she'll be selling." His wife did not answer. His wife had known Thomas Holloway. His wife had known how Thomas talked about his daughter, with that quiet pride men carry when they know they have raised something better than themselves. His wife said nothing. She passed him the potatoes. She thought, "Don't be so sure, Harold." She did not say it out loud, but she thought it. 3 years. That's what it took. 3 years of skinned knuckles and library books, and nights so cold the wrench would freeze to her bare hand if she forgot her gloves. 3 years of taking apart an engine that did not want to be taken apart, and then putting it back together with parts she had to forge herself because nobody made them anymore. The Lexington Public Library, built in 1923. 2 stories, yellow brick, a staircase that creaked on the 3rd step from the top, and a smell that was equal parts old paper and floor wax and somebody's coffee always brewing in the back office. The librarian was named Ingrid Solberg. She was 63 years old, Norwegian by birth. Widowed since 1959. She wore her white hair in a tight bun and her wedding ring on a chain around her neck, and she had never, not once, asked a patron what they wanted a book for. Margaret walked in on a Tuesday in May of 1969. She did not know what she was looking for. She knew she needed to learn how to bore a cylinder. She knew she needed to learn how to grind a crankshaft. She knew she needed to learn things her father had known by instinct and had never gotten around to teaching her. She stood at the front desk. Ingrid looked up. She had glasses on a chain. She lowered them. She studied Margaret's face the way a Norwegian woman studies a face. Slowly, without expression, looking for the truth under the surface. She said, "Holloway girl." "Yes, ma'am." "Your father used to come in here." "He did?" "Every Saturday. He read the agricultural journals." "I didn't know." "You wouldn't. He came when you were in school." Margaret felt something hot rise behind her eyes. She pushed it down. "Mrs. Solberg, I need books on engines." "What kind?" "Tractor engines. Farmall. The M series. From the 40s. Ingrid did not blink. She did not laugh. She just said, "Come with me." She led Margaret to the back, the technical section. Books with cracked spines and small print, the kind nobody had checked out in years. Ingrid pulled 3 of them off the shelf. Then 4. Then 6. She stacked them in Margaret's arms. She said, "I'll order more, from the state library, through interlibrary loan. It will take 2 weeks." "Mrs. Solberg." "Take them home, Margaret." "How much do I—" "Nothing. You bring them back when you're done, that's all." Margaret stood there. The books were heavy. She said, "Why are you helping me?" And Ingrid Solberg looked at her over the top of her reading glasses with those gray Norwegian eyes that had buried a husband and raised 3 sons and read more books than anyone in 3 counties. She said, "Because somebody should." And she went back to her desk. Margaret read at night. She read by the light of the bulb in the workshop, the same bulb her father had screwed in the summer of 1962. She read while her hands were too cold to hold a wrench. She read while her shoulders ached and her back ached and her eyes burned. She read until the words swam. And then she went out and did it. She bored cylinders with a homemade rig she built from an electric motor, and a length of pipe, and a cutting bit she ordered out of a catalog from Cincinnati. She ground valves on a tool she fabricated from a hand drill and a stone. She rebuilt the carburetor on her kitchen table because the workshop was too cold, and Eleanor watched her do it from the other side of the room, not speaking, not approving, just watching, until the morning of the coffee. It was December, the first real cold of the year, wind out of the northwest, snow on the porch. Margaret had been in the workshop since before sunrise. She was working on the head gasket. Her fingers had gone numb an hour ago. She kept blowing on them, kept rubbing them on her jeans, kept telling herself to focus. The workshop door opened. She did not turn around. She thought it was the wind. But then she smelled coffee. She turned. Her mother was standing there. Eleanor, in her housecoat and her boots and a heavy wool shawl over her shoulders. She was carrying a tin cup of coffee in one hand and a plate with a slice of bread and jam in the other. She did not look at Margaret. She did not look at the tractor. She walked to the workbench. She set the cup down. She set the plate down. She turned around. She walked back to the door, and as she was leaving, without looking back, she said, "It's cold out here." Then she was gone. Margaret stood there. She looked at the coffee. She looked at the door, and she sat down on her bucket, and she put her face in her hands, and she shook. Not crying. Something stronger than crying. Something that did not have a name. She drank the coffee. It was hot. It was strong. It had 3 spoonfuls of sugar in it, exactly the way her father had taken it. Eleanor remembered. Eleanor had not forgotten anything. That winter almost broke her. The winter of 1970 into 1971. It was the coldest winter in 20 years. The pipes froze. The chickens froze. The cattle stood in the lee of the barn and breathed steam and refused to move. Margaret was 23 years old, alone in her father's workshop. 3/4 of the way through rebuilding an engine she still wasn't sure was rebuildable. And then the bank called. The First National Bank of Lexington. A man named Harlan Pikesworth, who wore a blue suit and a nameplate and a smile that did not reach his eyes. He sat across from Margaret in his office on a Wednesday morning. He had her file open. He had numbers on a page. He said, "Margaret, we have a problem." "What problem?" "Your father's note. It comes due in March." "I know." "You're behind." "I know." "How are you going to pay it?" "I'm working on it." "Margaret, you have 90 days. Then we foreclose." "I don't want to. I knew your father. But the bank is the bank. Do you understand?" "I understand." She walked out of that office. She drove home in a blizzard. She did not tell Eleanor. That night, she went out to the workshop. She closed the door behind her. She looked at the half-rebuilt engine on the bench. She looked at the parts she still needed. The pistons she had not yet finished machining. The valve seats she had not yet cut. She thought, "I cannot do this." She thought, "I have to sell." She thought, "Harold Brennan is going to win." And then she sat down on the cold workshop floor with her back against the wall. And for the first time since her father's funeral, Margaret Holloway broke. All the way, crying so hard her ribs hurt, crying so hard she could not breathe, crying so hard she did not hear the door open, and did not hear the footsteps, and did not hear anything until the workshop went silent, and she finally looked up and saw nothing. Just the door, slightly open, snow blowing in through the gap. Nobody there. She got up. She wiped her face. She closed the door. She went to bed. She did not sleep. In the morning, she went out to the workshop to start over, to start the same impossible work she had been doing for a year and a half, to grind one more valve, bore one more cylinder, inch toward an ending she was no longer sure she would reach. And there, on the workshop floor, just inside the door, there was an envelope, plain, white, no name on it. Margaret picked it up. Her hands shook. She opened it. Inside, there was $300 in 20s, old 20s, the kind with the small portrait, and a piece of paper, folded once, with 5 lines written on it in a careful, shaky hand. "Your father was a good man. This is a debt I forgot to pay. Don't try to find me. Don't try to give it back. Just keep going. No signature, no date." Margaret read it 3 times. She walked to the door. She looked out across the white field. The snow was knee-deep. There were no footprints. The wind had erased them. She stood there a long time. Then she closed the door. She put the $300 in her father's coffee can on the top shelf. She picked up the wrench. She kept going. Spring came. She paid the bank. Just barely. $300 short, and the $300 on the workshop shelf made the difference. Harlan Pikesworth signed the papers and nodded at her and said, "Well, all right then." And he did not smile because Harlan Pikesworth did not smile, but he did not foreclose. Summer came. Margaret kept working. Fall came. She finished the engine. Winter came again. She rebuilt the transmission. And finally, it was the spring of 1972. Margaret was 25 years old. She did not tell anyone. She did not want anyone there. She did not want eyes. She did not want voices. She did not want anything except the quiet of a Tuesday morning in April, 3 years almost to the day since the auction. She got up at 5. She made coffee. She drank it standing at the kitchen window, watching the sun come up red over the eastern field. Eleanor came into the kitchen at 6. She did not say good morning. She just looked at her daughter. She looked at her daughter's face, and Eleanor knew, the way a mother knows. Eleanor said, "Today? Today. Do you want me to come out?" "No." "All right." That was all. Margaret put on her coat. She put on her gloves. She put her father's notebook in her shirt pocket, where she always kept it now, against her heart. She walked out to the workshop. The Farmall was waiting. It looked different now. Cleaner. The body was still the same. Still scratched. Still scarred. The word junk was still faintly visible on the hood, where she had not been able to fully scrub it out. But the engine was new, or as new as a 30-year-old engine could be. Every gasket replaced, every bolt retorqued, every wire rewrapped, every drop of oil and grease and coolant fresh from the can. She climbed up. She sat in the seat. The cracked leather was cold through her jeans. She put her hand on the starter. Her hand was shaking. She thought, 3 years, she thought, 3 years of laughing. She thought, if this doesn't start, I have lost everything. She pushed the starter. Click. Nothing. Her heart dropped through her stomach into her boots. She pushed it again. Click. A cough. A wheeze. Nothing. She closed her eyes. She thought, Dad. She thought, please. She pushed the starter a third time, and the Farmall coughed, and coughed again, and coughed a third time, and then, like a man waking up from a long, long sleep, like a heart that has stopped for 17 years and is now somehow, impossibly, ridiculously, beautifully starting back up. The engine roared. White smoke. A cloud of it. Out the exhaust stack. Into the gray morning air. Into the workshop. Into the sky. The Farmall was alive. Margaret sat on it, and she did not move. She just sat. And the tears came. Not the broken kind. The other kind. The kind that come when something you have been carrying for years finally sets you down. She heard the kitchen door open. She looked. Eleanor was running. Her mother was running, in her housecoat and her slippers, across the muddy yard, toward the workshop, toward the running tractor, toward her daughter. Eleanor stopped at the workshop door. She looked at Margaret on the tractor. And Eleanor Holloway, 50 years old, a woman who had not hugged her daughter since the funeral. A woman who had told her daughter she was not a man. A woman who had said, God help you, because nobody else will. Eleanor Holloway climbed up onto the running tractor. She put her arms around her daughter. She held her. Hard, and in Margaret's ear, over the sound of the engine, over the sound of her own crying, over the sound of 3 years of laughter finally going silent, Eleanor said, Your father would be so proud. That was the moment. That was the morning. That was when Margaret Holloway started winning. Harold Brennan drove past the Holloway place that morning. He was in his pickup. He was on his way to a sales call in Cozad. He was a busy man. He saw the smoke first, coming from the workshop. He slowed down. He saw the tractor in the yard, the red Farmall M running, engine smoke curling up into the cold blue sky. He saw the 2 women on it, mother and daughter, holding each other. Harold Brennan did not stop. He did not wave. He did not nod. He stepped on the gas, harder than necessary. He drove past the Holloway farm at 50 miles an hour and did not look back. When he got to Cozad, he sat in his truck in the parking lot for 10 minutes before he went inside to make his sale. He kept seeing that tractor. He kept seeing the smoke. He kept seeing the 2 women. He thought, That tractor is not supposed to run. He thought. That girl was supposed to fail. He thought, what does it mean if she didn't? He did not have an answer. He went inside. He made a sale. He drove home. He poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon, and he sat in his recliner, and he did not say a word to his wife at dinner. His wife passed him the potatoes. She did not say, I told you so, but she thought it. The next 13 years were quieter, not easier, not by a long shot, but quieter. Margaret farmed her 80 acres with the Farmall. She did not buy a new tractor. She did not take out loans. She did not expand. While all around her, the men of Dawson County were borrowing money and buying bigger equipment and tearing up old fence lines to plant fence row to fence row, Margaret kept her 80 acres and kept her Farmall running and kept her money in a savings account at a bank in Cozad, where Harlan Pikesworth could not see it. She lived small. She lived careful. And she lived. The summer of 1976 was the worst summer of her life up to that point. The drought. The rains stopped in May. It did not start again until September. The corn came up 6 inches and then turned yellow at the edges, then brown, then dead. The soybeans were worse. They never came up at all. The fields cracked. The creek went dry. The cattle stood in the dust and watched the sky and did not understand why the sky had stopped being a sky and started being just a hot blue ceiling. Margaret was 29 years old. She watched her year die. She did not know what to do. She sold the chickens. She sold the calves. She sold the deep freezer in the back porch. She sold every piece of furniture in the house that was not bolted down. She sold her father's good coat. She sold the silver candlesticks her grandmother had brought from Pennsylvania. It was not enough. The banknote was coming due again, and the morning she sat down at the kitchen table to count what she had left and realized she was $800 short. $800 in 1976. It might as well have been $1 million. She put her head down on the table. She did not cry. She had run out of crying. She just sat there with her forehead pressed against the cold wood, and she tried to think, and she could not think. Eleanor came in. Eleanor was 55 now. Her hair had started going gray at the temples. Her hands had started showing the veins. She was still tall, still straight, still the same Eleanor she had always been, but softer. The years had softened her in places Margaret had not known her mother could be softened. Eleanor sat down across from her. She did not ask what was wrong. She knew what was wrong. She put her hand flat on the table. She slid something across. It was small. It was gold. It caught the kitchen light. Margaret looked. Her mother's wedding ring. Mom, take it. Mom, no. Margaret, take it. I can't take that. You can. You will. Mom, that's your wedding ring. That's Dad's ring. Eleanor looked at her daughter. Eleanor's eyes were wet, but Eleanor was not crying because Eleanor did not cry. She said, Margaret, it's metal. You are my flesh and blood. Take it. Margaret picked up the ring. It was warm from her mother's hand. She drove into Lexington that afternoon. She sold the ring at the pawn shop on Main Street. The man behind the counter weighed it and looked at it through a loop and gave her $820. She paid the bank. She drove home. She did not tell her mother where she had gone. She did not have to. Eleanor was at the kitchen window when she pulled up. Eleanor watched her daughter walk from the truck to the house. Eleanor met her at the door. Eleanor took her hands, and the two of them stood there in the kitchen doorway. The mother, the daughter, the 2 Holloway women, quiet, together. not saying a single word. They did not have to. 3 years after the drought, Harold Brennan came for her. It was 1979. Margaret was 32. Harold was 57. He had gotten heavier. He had started parting his hair on the other side to hide the thinning. He had also started buying up land. Quietly. Through a holding company. Through middlemen. He had bought 100 acres west of town and 300 acres north, and he had his eye on the 80 acres along the Platte River that belonged to a young woman with a dead father and a running tractor. He came to her himself this time. He drove out to the Holloway farm on a Saturday morning in October. He parked his Buick in the yard. He got out. He walked to the workshop where Margaret was changing the oil on a neighbor's tractor. He stood in the doorway. She did not look up. She said, "Mr. Brennan?" "Margaret, what can I do for you?" "I have an offer for you." "I'm not interested." "You haven't heard it." "I don't need to." She tightened a bolt. She wiped her hands. She finally stood up and looked at him. He smiled. The same smile. The same one from 10 years ago. The patient smile. He said, $45,000. "For what?" "For your 80 acres. My land's not for sale." "Margaret, that's twice what it's worth." "Then you must want it pretty bad." He laughed. She did not. He stepped further into the workshop. He looked around. The Farmall in the corner. The neighbor's tractor on jacks. The workbench. The tools. He said, "Margaret, listen to me." "I'm listening." "You cannot hold on forever." She looked at him. She looked at his fat, soft hand. She looked at his wristwatch. She looked at the gold ring on his pinky that he had not been wearing 10 years ago. She said, "Mr. Brennan." "Yes." "I don't need to hold on forever." "No?" "I just need to hold on longer than you." The smile slipped. It slipped all the way off his face this time. And underneath, where the smile had been, Margaret saw something she had not seen before. She saw a man who had spent 10 years pretending he had forgotten about her. And she saw, in that one slipped moment, that he had not forgotten about her. Not for a day. Not for an hour. He had remembered. He had remembered the laughter. He had remembered being wrong, and he hated her for it. He turned around. He walked out of the workshop. He got in his Buick. He drove away, and Margaret stood there with the wrench in her hand and the smell of motor oil in her nose, and she thought, very quietly, "I have you. I don't know how yet, but I have you." The years rolled on. The 80s came. Reagan was president. Farm Aid was on TV. The interest rates were climbing, and the commodity prices were falling, and all over Dawson County, all over Nebraska, all over the Midwest, farmers were drowning. Margaret was not drowning. Margaret was, slowly, becoming something else. Word had spread. Word had spread that the Holloway girl could fix anything. It started with one farmer, then 2, then 5. By 1982, there was a line at her workshop every Saturday. Men who had laughed at her 10 years ago. Men whose wives had laughed with them. Men who now stood in her yard with their hats in their hands and asked her, very politely, if she could maybe take a look at their transmission. She fixed their tractors. She did not gloat. She did not smile. She did not say, "I remember." She just charged a fair rate and did the work and sent them home with running equipment. But sometimes, when she was alone in the workshop after they had gone, she would press her hand against the side of the Farmall, and she would think, "Look at us. Look at what we did." In August of 1983, An old pickup truck pulled into the yard. Margaret was 36. She did not recognize the truck. She came out of the workshop wiping her hands on a rag. The man who climbed out was maybe 60. He had a kind face. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had not slept well in a long time. He said, "Miss Holloway?" "Yes. My name is Carter Halloran." She stopped. The name went through her like a current. Halloran. "Yes, ma'am. Wendell was my father." Was. She heard the was before she heard anything else. She felt it. She put her hand on the bed of the truck to steady herself. She said, "When?" "A week ago, Tuesday. He went peaceful, in his sleep." "I didn't know." "Nobody knew, ma'am. He was a private man." "He was." Carter Halloran looked at his boots. He took a breath. He said, "Miss Holloway, my dad left a note. For you." "For me?" "Yes, ma'am." He reached into his shirt pocket. He took out an envelope. It was old. It had been folded and refolded. He held it out to her. Margaret took it. Her hands, steady all morning. Now they were not steady. She opened it. The handwriting was shaky. The hand of a man near the end. But it was the same handwriting. The same careful hand. The same hand that had written "Don't try to find me" 13 years ago and left $300 on a workshop floor. She knew before she read it. She knew it had been him. The note said, "Margaret, I'm sorry I never told you. I was the one who left the money in your shop. The winter of 1970. I knew you were in trouble. I knew you were proud. I left it anyway. I hope it helped. I should tell you something else. Your father saved my life in the spring of 1942. I had a wreck on the road coming back from Omaha. My truck went off the bridge. He pulled me out of the water. He drove me to the hospital. He sat with me until my wife came. He never told anyone. He never asked for anything. That night at the auction, I should have bid against you. I should have helped you. I should have done something. I didn't. I told myself I was respecting your right to make your own choice. The truth is, I was too old and too scared to stand up to those men. I'm ashamed of that. The $300 was the only thing I knew how to do. I owed your father more than that. I owe him more than I can pay. Live good, Margaret. Wendell?" Margaret read it once. She read it twice. She folded the letter. She put it in her shirt pocket, next to her father's notebook. She looked at Carter Halloran. She said, "Thank you for bringing this to me." "Yes, ma'am." "Will you stay for coffee?" "I would like that, ma'am. Very much." So she took him into the kitchen, and Eleanor poured the coffee, and the three of them sat at the table where Margaret had once put her head down and given up. And nobody said anything for a long time. And later that night, after Carter had driven away, Margaret went out to the workshop. She sat down on her bucket. She looked at the Farmall. She thought about a quiet old man on a porch with a cold cup of coffee. She thought about a young father in the spring of 1942 pulling a stranger out of a river. She thought about how kindness travels, how it travels across years, how it travels across generations, how it pays itself back in ways nobody ever sees. She put her hand against the Farmall's fender. She said out loud to the empty workshop, "Look what we started." Then came the spring of 1985. The farm crisis. The interest rates spiked. The commodity prices collapsed. The land values dropped through the floor. Farmers who had borrowed to expand in the 70s now owed more than their farms were worth. Foreclosure notices appeared on mailboxes every week. Auctions every weekend. Margaret had $42,000 in the bank. No debt. A running tractor. A workshop full of customers. A mother who hugged her on Christmas morning. A father in the ground who had told her, in pencil, in a notebook, that the world would try to tell her who she was, and she should not listen. She had listened to the right voice. She was about to find out how much it had cost the man who had laughed at her. It was a Tuesday in May of 1985. Margaret was in the workshop. She was rebuilding a hydraulic pump for a Ford 8N. The afternoon light was gold. The radio was on, low, playing some old Hank Williams song that Margaret half remembered from her father's kitchen on Saturday nights. She heard a truck pull in. She did not turn around. She heard a door open. She heard a door close. She heard footsteps. Slow ones. The footsteps of a man who did not want to be where he was. She heard a voice. Margaret! She froze. She knew that voice. She had not heard it in person in 6 years. She turned around. Harold Brennan. He was 63 years old. He had lost weight. He had lost it badly. The flesh hung loose on his face. His clothes did not fit. The confident smile was gone. The wristwatch was gone. The gold ring was gone. The clean white shirt was a soft blue work shirt with a coffee stain on the cuff. He was holding his hat. He was standing in her workshop, holding his hat in his hands like a man at a funeral. Margaret put down her wrench. She wiped her hands on her rag. She said, "Harold." "Margaret, what can I do for you?" He looked at the floor. He looked at the Farmall, parked in the corner where it always was now, the way an old dog lies down in the same spot every night. He looked at Margaret. He said, "I have 3 tractors at the dealership." "All right." "My mechanics can't fix them." "All right." "The factory rep wants more than the tractors are worth." "All right." "They tell me." He stopped. He cleared his throat. He started again. "They tell me you're the only one in the county who can do it." She did not answer for a long moment. She looked at him. She looked at the man who had laughed at her in front of 200 people on a cold April morning in 1969. She looked at the man who had told her father, God rest him, would be rolling in his grave. She looked at the man who had tried to buy her land for $45,000 and walked out of this workshop hating her for not being a fool. And he looked smaller. He looked like a man who had not slept well in months. He looked like a man who had finally understood, after 63 years on this earth, that he had been wrong about something important, and the wrongness had eaten him alive from the inside. Margaret said, "Bring them over." His face moved. It moved in a way she had never seen a man's face move. He said, "Margaret." "Yes." "I." He stopped. He started. He stopped. He looked at the workshop floor. He said quietly, the way a man speaks when he's about to break, "I was wrong about you. I have been wrong for a long time. I have done a lot of damage in this county, to a lot of people, with my advice, with my smile, with my promises. I want you to know that you were right." She did not speak. He did not look up. He said, "I haven't been sleeping for a long time. I don't sleep, Margaret." She said, "I know." He nodded. He put his hat back on. He turned around. He walked out of the workshop. He got in his truck. He drove away. Margaret stood there with the wrench in her hand and the smell of motor oil in her nose, and for the first time since the auction, she did not feel triumph. She did not feel revenge. She did not feel anything sharp at all. She felt sad. She felt sad for a man who had wasted 63 years being wrong. She felt sad for the wife who had passed him the potatoes in silence for 10 years. She felt sad for every farmer in Dawson County he had pushed into debt they could not carry. She put the wrench down. In October of 1985, she found the crack. She was doing the annual maintenance, the ritual she had done every fall since 1972. Check the oil, check the coolant, check the gaskets, check the belts, check every inch of the old red tractor that had carried her through 16 years of being right when everyone said she was wrong. She found the crack on a Saturday afternoon. It was thin, a hairline, running along the seam where the crankcase met the main block. She knew what it meant. It meant the engine had to come apart, all the way apart. Not the way she had taken it apart in 1969, with all the urgency of a young woman trying to save a farm. The new way, the patient way, the way you take apart something you love because you have finally accepted that you cannot keep it together forever. She spent a week getting it ready. She ordered a replacement block from a salvage yard in Kansas. While she waited for it to ship, she decided to do something she had never done before. She decided to take the engine all the way down to the bare block, to document every inch, to honor it, the way you honor an old friend. So on a Tuesday in October of 1985, with the cottonwoods turning yellow outside the workshop door, Margaret Holloway began the final teardown of the Farmall M she had bought for $75 16 years before. She worked methodically. She removed the head. She pulled the pistons. She extracted the crankshaft. She cleaned every part and laid it out on the workbench in the order it had come out. The workshop floor was clean. The light was good. Her hands were steady. She was 38 years old. She had done this work for so long now that her hands knew it the way a pianist's hands know a song. And then she came to the oil pan. She drained it. She removed the bolts. She lifted it off the block. She turned it upside down on the bench to clean it out. And she looked at it. She looked at the inside of the oil pan she had drained 100 times over 16 years. She looked at the bottom of it, and she felt the world go very still, because the bottom of the oil pan was not the bottom of the oil pan. There were 2 layers. There was a second plate, welded in. From the inside, welded carefully. Welded the way a man welds something he is hiding. About 2 inches of space. A hidden compartment in the bottom of the crankcase that she had been driving over for 16 years. Margaret sat down on her bucket. Her hands were not steady anymore. She looked at the oil pan. She looked at the secret it had been carrying, and she heard her own voice say out loud in the empty workshop, 16 years. This tractor has been hiding a secret for 16 years. She picked up her cutting torch. She lit the flame. And in the gold October light of a Nebraska afternoon, Margaret Holloway began to cut. The torch sang. Blue flame, quiet roar, the kind of sound that fills a workshop and pushes everything else out. Margaret bent over the oil pan. She cut slow. She cut careful. The weld gave. A thin line opened. She killed the torch. She set it down. She lifted the false plate. And there, tucked into the hollow space, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather pouch. Margaret did not pick it up at first. She just looked. Because some things you have to look at before you touch them. Some things ask to be witnessed. She reached in. She lifted it out. The leather was soft, cool. The kind of leather that has been sitting in oil so long it has half turned to oil itself. She set it on the workbench. She unwrapped the oilcloth. She opened the pouch. 3 things fell out. A roll of money, folded once, tied with brown string. A folded paper, heavy, official, and a letter. 4 pages. Cream-colored, the handwriting on the front page neat, careful. She picked up the money first. She untied the string. She counted. Old bills, 20s, 50s, some hundreds. The portraits on them were the small kind, the kind they printed before 1948. $3,200. She counted twice to be sure. She set the money down. She picked up the folded paper. A deed. 40 acres of farmland. Frontier County, Nebraska. Filed October 14th, 1949. Owner: Edmund Whitaker. Margaret stared at the name. The Whitaker estate, the auction, the 1948 Farmall M sat in a barn since '52. Edmund Whitaker, the man whose tractor had been hers for 16 years. She set the deed down on the bench. She looked at the letter. She did not pick it up right away, because she knew. The way you know. The way you know when somebody is about to tell you something that will change you. She sat down on her bucket. She made herself breathe. She picked up the letter. She started to read. To whoever finds this. My name is Edmund Whitaker. If you are reading this, I am probably dead. I am writing this in November of 1952. The doctor in Lexington says my heart is failing. He gives me a month, maybe 2. I have a thing I need to say before I go. In October of 1951, the Granger County Farmers Bank was robbed. $8,000 in cash. 2 men with guns. They took the money. They drove away. The sheriff said they headed west. They never caught them. Not at first. Here is what nobody knows. I found the money. Margaret stopped reading. She held her breath. She started again. I was driving home from the feed store on a side road north of Curtis. October 14th, 1951. A truck was broken down on the shoulder. 2 men. One older, one young. The young one could not have been more than 19. He was sweating. He was shaking. His eyes were wet. I stopped to help. The way you do. The way my father taught me to do. They were nervous. I thought it was the truck. I helped them push it onto the shoulder. A canvas bag slid out of the back. The bag split. Money. Bank straps still on it. The name of the Granger County Farmers Bank printed across them. They saw me see it. The older one pulled a gun. I thought I was going to die. I thought of my wife. Her name was Ruth. She was sick. The doctor in Lexington had told us the month before. Ovarian cancer. The bills were already piling up. I thought, Lord, if you take me now, what becomes of her? And then a car came around the bend. A family. A man. A woman. 3 children in the back seat. The kind of car you do not shoot a man in front of. The 2 robbers panicked. They grabbed what they could carry. They ran. Into the field. The young one was crying. I could hear him crying as he ran. I will hear him crying for the rest of my life. They left the truck. They left me. They left about half the money. Margaret put the letter down. She put her hand over her mouth. She picked the letter back up. I should have called the sheriff. I know that. But Ruth was dying. And the doctor bills. And I thought God had answered a prayer I had not even known how to pray. I took the money. I drove home. I hid it in the barn. $6,400. I did not count it for 2 days. I could not bring myself to. I never spent a single dollar on us. Not one. Ruth died in March of 1952. She never knew. The bills did not get paid. I let them pile up on the kitchen table. The money was not mine. It was not the bank's anymore either. They had been made whole by their insurance. I had read it in the paper. The 2 robbers had been caught in Cheyenne with $1,500 on them. They went to prison. The case was closed. But the money still was not mine. So I tried to do something with it. There was a family in Frontier County, the Bowmans. They were 3 years behind on their note. The bank was going to foreclose. 40 acres, good land, bottom ground along the South Loop. I went to a lawyer in North Platte. I paid him cash. He bought the 40 acres in my name. I told the Bowmans they could stay. Free. As long as they wanted. They thought I was an angel. I was not an angel. I was a man trying to wash blood off his hands. The deed for those 40 acres is in this pouch. The rest of the money is here too. $3,200. I could not spend it. I could not give it back. I could not throw it away. So I hid it. I hid it in the only thing I ever truly loved. This tractor. Margaret's eyes blurred. She kept reading. I am going to do something strange. I am going to seal the engine. Carefully. I am going to drain the old oil and put in new. I am going to weld the false plate into the oil pan. I am going to make sure the engine can sit. For years, for decades, until somebody finds it. Because here is what I have come to believe. If God lets a man steal money and not be caught, then God is asking that man a question. The question is, what kind of man are you? The answer is, in what you do next. I do not want to choose who gets this money. I do not trust myself to choose. So I am going to leave the rest. In this tractor, sealed up, waiting. I am going to pray that whoever finds it is someone who has earned it. Not by luck, not by inheritance, not by being clever, by being patient, by being stubborn, by keeping this tractor running for years, for long enough that they prove they are the kind of person who deserves to find a thing like this. I do not know who you are. I will never know, but I have prayed for you every night since I welded that plate in. I have prayed that you would be good, that you would be kind, that you would be the kind of person who finds money like this and does not waste it. If I am right, then this is the only good thing I ever did. Edmund Whitaker, November 11th, 1952. Margaret set the letter down. She did not move. She sat on her bucket in the workshop, and she did not move for a long, long time. She had been driving Edmund Whitaker's prayer for 16 years. She did not cry. She just sat, and she let herself be the answer to a dying man's prayer. She carried it for a week. She did not sleep. On the 7th day, she got in her pickup, and she drove to town. She drove to the Methodist Church on Main Street in Lexington. The parsonage was attached to the back. A small white house, green shutters, a little porch with 2 metal chairs. The minister was a man named Boyd Tillman. He was 58 years old. He had been the minister of that church since 1962. He had buried Margaret's father. He had married 3 of her cousins. He had baptized a long, long line of Holloway babies going back to before the war. He listened more than he talked, which was strange in a man whose job it was to talk. Margaret knocked on the parsonage door. He opened it. He saw her face. He said, "Margaret, come in." He did not ask why. He sat her down at his kitchen table. He poured her a cup of coffee. He sat down across from her. He waited. She told him. The whole thing. The auction, the seal, the years, the bank money, the deed, the letter, the dying man and his prayer, and the question he had not been able to answer. She talked for an hour. Boyd Tillman listened. He did not interrupt. He did not gasp. He did not say, "Oh, my child." He just listened. When Margaret was done, she said, "Reverend, what do I do?" He drank his coffee. He set the cup down. He said, "Margaret, I am not going to tell you what to do. But listen to me. Yes, you have lived your whole life refusing to let other people tell you who you are. You walked into that auction in 1969, a girl, alone, and you bid against a barn full of men. You spent 16 years proving that nobody could write your story but you." She did not breathe. He said, "I am not going to write it for you now." She looked at her hands. He said, "But I will ask you one thing. Margaret, who do you want to be after you decide?" She did not answer right away. She looked at the table, the grain in the wood, the ring from her coffee cup. She said, very quietly, "I want to be the kind of woman my father thought I was." Boyd Tillman did not smile, but his face did something a smile does. The skin around his eyes softened. He said, "Then I think you already know what to do." She drove home in the dark. She thought all the way. She thought about the money, the $3,200, old bills from a robbery that was older than she was. She thought about the farm crisis, the families, the kitchens where mothers were trying to feed children on nothing, the men in barns with their heads in their hands. She thought, that money was stolen from people. 60 years ago, the people who lost it have been made whole. The thieves have served their time. The man who hid it is dead. She thought, so I will give it forward. Quietly, not in my name. She drove past her own farm. The kitchen light was on. Eleanor was waiting up. Margaret pulled into the yard. She sat in the truck for a moment. She got out. She went inside. She told her mother everything. Eleanor listened. She listened for 45 minutes. She did not interrupt. When Margaret was done, Eleanor sat very still at the kitchen table. She had her hands folded. Her hair was down. She had been about to go to bed when Margaret came in. She was wearing her old blue nightgown with the white piping. She looked, for a moment, like a woman much younger than 64. She said, "Margaret." "Yes, Mom." "Do you remember what I said to you? The night you came home from the auction?" "I remember. I told you it was not your work." "I remember, Mom. I told you God help you because nobody else will." "Mom, you don't have to." "Margaret, let me say this." "All right." Eleanor took a breath. She said, "I was wrong. Mom, I was wrong about you from the day your father died. I wanted to keep you safe. I thought safe meant small. I thought safe meant married. I thought safe meant somewhere else." "Mom, I was wrong." Margaret was crying now. She did not try to stop. Eleanor reached across the table. She took her daughter's hand. She said, "I am proud of you. I have been proud of you every day for 16 years, and I have not told you. I am sorry. I am telling you now." Margaret could not speak. She just nodded. Eleanor said, "Use the money, the way you said, quietly, the way your father would have. Just quietly." Margaret nodded again. Eleanor squeezed her hand. She said, "Now eat. There is pot roast in the icebox." Margaret laughed, a small laugh, a wet one, but a laugh. She set up the fund through the church. Boyd Tillman ran it. Nobody else knew. Not the deacons, not the secretary, not the families who got the envelopes. The fund did not have a name. The envelopes did not have a return address. They just showed up. in mailboxes, slipped under doors, tucked into the hymnals of farmers who came to church on Sunday morning, carrying foreclosure notices in their wallets. $200 in cash, $300, $500, sometimes $1,000. The amounts varied with what the families needed. Boyd knew who needed what. He had been their minister for 23 years. The envelopes came with a note, 5 words, always the same. Your father was a good man, or sometimes, your mother was a good woman, or sometimes just a debt long forgotten. The money was gone in 8 months. $3,200 went a long way in 1985 in Dawson County. Nobody ever found out who had sent it. Nobody but Margaret, and Eleanor, and Boyd Tillman, and somewhere, Edmund Whitaker, watching. The 40 acres in Frontier County was a different matter. Margaret drove out there in the spring of 1986. She was 39. She took the highway west through Cozad and then south on the gravel roads until she came to the bottom ground along the South Loop River. The land was flat, fertile. She found the address from the deed. There was no house left. There was a foundation, a few stones, a chimney that the wind had not yet knocked down, a pump handle rusted in the up position, a windmill with 2 blades missing. The Bowmans were gone. She drove into the nearest small town and went to the courthouse. She looked them up. The last Bowman, the only daughter, had died in a nursing home in 1979. No children, no grandchildren, no heirs. It took her a year to clear the title. A lawyer in North Platte helped her, a young man named Kessler. He charged her $300 and would not take more. She owned the land free and clear by April of 1986. She did not keep it all. There was a young woman in Frontier County. Her name was Adeline Marsh. She was 24 years old. She was a widow. Her husband had been killed in a hay baler accident in the summer of 1985. He had been 26. He had left her with 2 children, a boy of 3, a girl of 1. He had left her with no insurance and no savings, and a small piece of leased ground she could not afford to keep leasing. Margaret heard about her through the church. Margaret drove out to meet her on a Tuesday afternoon in May of 1986. Adeline Marsh was in the yard of a small rented house outside the town of Stockville. She was hanging laundry on a line. The boy was playing in the dirt with a tin truck. The baby was on a blanket on the porch. Margaret got out of her pickup. Adeline turned. She had red hair, the kind of red that comes from somewhere Irish a long time ago. She had freckles. She had eyes that had seen too much in too little time. She said, "Can I help you, ma'am?" Margaret said, "My name is Margaret Holloway." "Yes, ma'am. I have something I want to ask you." "All right." Margaret looked at the laundry on the line. She looked at the boy with the tin truck. She looked at the baby on the blanket. She thought, that was me. That was me 16 years ago, except I did not have children. I had a tractor and a mother and a dead father and a notebook in my pocket. She said, "Mrs. Marsh, do you want to farm?" Adeline blinked. She said, "Ma'am, I cannot afford to farm." "That is not what I asked." Adeline looked at her. She said, "Yes, I want to farm. It is the only thing I want. It is what me and Tommy wanted, before." Margaret nodded. She reached into her jacket. She pulled out a folded piece of paper. She said, "Mrs. Marsh, I have 20 acres of bottom land along the South Loop. I want to sell it to you for $1. Adeline did not move. She did not understand. She said, "Ma'am, $1. The land is yours. The deed is signed. The lawyer in North Platte has everything ready. You just have to sign your name." "Why?" Margaret looked at her. She looked at this young red-haired widow with 2 babies and laundry on a line and dirt under her fingernails. She said, "Because you remind me of me, 16 years ago. And somebody once tried to do this for me, quietly, and I never got to thank him properly. So I am thanking him this way, by doing it for you." Adeline started to cry. She did not make a sound. She just stood there with her hands at her sides, and the tears ran down her face, and the boy in the dirt looked up, and the baby on the blanket smiled. Margaret said, "Mrs. Marsh?" "Yes, ma'am." "Don't let anybody tell you who you are." Adeline nodded. Margaret put the paper in her hand. She got back in her pickup. She drove home. She kept 20 acres of the Whitaker land for herself. She added them to her farm. She farmed them carefully. She called them, in her own head, just to herself, the Whitaker field, in honor of a dying man and his prayer. In the fall of 1985, after the harvest, Margaret drove into Lexington. She drove to Brennan Equipment. The lot was almost empty. The tractors that were still there had for sale signs in the windows. The big neon John Deere sign on the front of the building had a busted letter. The R was dark. She parked in front of the office. She went inside. Harold Brennan was sitting at his desk. He was alone. The receptionist was gone. The mechanics were gone. The salesmen were gone. The dealership was in the last weeks of its life, and Harold Brennan was sitting alone in the front office, watching the parking lot through the dirty plate glass window. He looked up when she came in. He said, "Margaret." She said, "Harold." He gestured at the chair across from his desk. She sat down. He said, "If you have come to enjoy it, you are welcome to." "I haven't." "Then why?" She took a breath. She said, "I am expanding the repair shop at my place." "All right. I am going to take on more equipment than I can handle alone. I need a partner." He looked at her. He did not understand what she was saying. She said, "Harold, I need somebody who knows the business side, the customer side, the accounting, the ordering. I am a mechanic. I am not a businesswoman. I never wanted to be." He still did not understand. She said, "I am offering you a job." His face did not move. Then his mouth opened. Then it closed. Then he said, very quietly, "Margaret." "Yes." "Why?" "Because my father told me something. When I was small. He said, 'Anger is a bag you carry. Every day it gets heavier. The only way to set it down is to set it down.' I have carried you for 16 years, Harold. I am tired of carrying you. This is how I set you down." He looked at his hands. She watched a tear come. Just one. It traveled down the side of his nose. It hung at the edge of his jaw. It fell on the desk blotter. He said, "I do not deserve this." "That is not the point." "Margaret." "That is not the point, Harold." She stood up. She put a piece of paper on his desk. Her phone number, the address of the workshop, the hours she would expect him to start if he said yes. She said, "Take the week, think about it, then come or don't." She walked out. She got in her truck. She drove home. He came on Monday morning, 7 o'clock sharp. He was wearing a clean blue work shirt. He worked for her until he could not work anymore. 23 years. In April of 1989, 20 years after the day Margaret Holloway had bought a piece of junk for $75, the Dawson County equipment auction came around again. Margaret was 42 years old. She did not come to buy. She came to sell. She had brought a few pieces of equipment she did not need anymore. A hay rake, a cultivator, a few hand tools, and the Farmall M. The decision had not been easy. She had thought about it for 2 years. The tractor was 41 years old. The crack in the block had been welded. It would not last forever. Parts were almost impossible to find. Margaret had been making her own for 10 years now. But more than that, the tractor had finished its work. It had taught her everything. It had carried a secret across 40 years and delivered it to exactly the right person at exactly the right time. It had proven her right when everyone said she was wrong. It had proven Edmund Whitaker's prayer answered. It was time. The auction yard was full that morning. Word had gotten around. The Holloway tractor was going up for sale. The tractor everyone had laughed at. Buck Reasoner was still calling the auction. He was 78 now. He had a cane. He had a voice that had lost some of its saw blade. But he still climbed up onto the stand, and he still sang the numbers. He called the Farmall last, the same way he had called it last 20 years before. He looked at it. He looked at the crowd. He smiled. He said, "All right, folks. Here it is. Most famous tractor in 3 counties. 1948 Farmall M. Purchased at this same auction in 1969 for $75 by Miss Margaret Holloway. Fully restored. 20 years of continuous operation. 1 owner since restoration. Miss Holloway has set a reserve of $5,000. Hands went up. A lot of hands. The bidding climbed. 5,000, 6, 7, 8. Margaret stood at the edge of the crowd. Harold Brennan was beside her. Eleanor was at home, sitting on the porch in her rocking chair. 10,000, 11. A pause. Buck Reasoner waited. 12,000, 12,5. Going once, going twice. Sold for $12,500 to a collector from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The crowd applauded. It was strange to hear applause where, 20 years before, there had been laughter. Margaret watched the buyer load the Farmall onto his trailer. She did not cry. She just watched. She put her hand on the fender one last time. She said, very quietly, to the tractor, "Thank you." That was all. Harold Brennan, beside her, looked at her with his hat in his hand. He said, $12,500 for a tractor you paid $75 for. Margaret laughed, a real laugh. She said, "No, Harold. That was $12,500 for 16 years of being right when everybody said I was wrong. The tractor was just the evidence." The trailer pulled away. Margaret watched it go. She got in her pickup. She drove home. Eleanor died in the spring of 2001. She was 80. She died in her own bed, in the house her husband had built her, with her daughter holding her hand. The last thing she said was, "Margaret, I was wrong about you. Thank you for not listening to me." Then she closed her eyes. She did not open them again. Margaret sat with her for 2 hours after. Then she got up. She made coffee. She drank it standing at the kitchen window, watching the sun come up red over the eastern field. It is 2026 now. Margaret Holloway is 79 years old. She still lives on the farm. She farms a smaller piece now. The workshop is still there. The Farmall is in a museum in Cedar Rapids. It still runs. The collector kept his word. Adeline Marsh is 64. She still farms in Frontier County. Her son is a county commissioner. Her daughter is an agricultural extension agent. Harold Brennan has been gone 17 years. His widow brought Margaret a wooden box at the funeral. Inside, there was a notebook. Harold's handwriting. A list. 47 names. The names of the farmers he had helped quietly over the 23 years he had worked for Margaret Holloway. Margaret keeps 2 things on her bedside table: her father's notebook and Edmund Whitaker's letter. Sometimes, late at night, she takes them out. She reads them. She thinks about the men, the dead father, the dead stranger, both of them speaking to her across years. She thinks about her mother. She thinks about Wendell Halloran. She thinks about Ingrid Solberg. She thinks about Harold Brennan and his 47 names. She thinks about Adeline Marsh. She thinks about the tractor, the $75 tractor that everyone laughed at. She turns off the light. Outside, the wind comes across the prairie. And somewhere in the dark, a meadowlark on a fence post sleeps, waiting for morning to sing. And the girl who paid $75 for a piece of junk. The girl whose father told her to decide for herself. That woman. That 79-year-old farmer in a small house outside Lexington. She sleeps. She sleeps the deep sleep of a woman who has lived her life her own way. The story keeps going, the way the best stories do.